Hi friends, it's Jasmine with the Still Earth Collection. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to be talking all about sphagnum moss and what an awesome medium it can be to help your plants root. As we know, roots are the foundation of a healthy plant, and whether we're using that to establish a plant on a moss pole like the Scindapsus or propagate a plant like this Monstera cutting, or a little more advanced projects like air layering, where you can establish roots on the vine of a plant before cutting it off the mother plant in order to get some really healthy roots so that it experiences less shock. So the first plant that we're going to be talking about tonight is this marble queen pothos. This plant is really special to me. I started it growing from little cuttings. Let's see, this would have been almost 3 years ago, more like 2.5. And it was a plant that was from my husband's celebration of life. So it's really precious to me, and I also was really hesitant to trim this plant very much. And so what we've got is this really great big leggy vine that is, it's getting a little long. It's really healthy still, and you can tell that where I propagated this plant, here, it's already got some new growth on nodes that are already established. They already have shoots on them, so that's the beauty of giving a plant a cutting, is that you create more fullness. But I still would love to see more fullness in the pot here. We have 3 really long vines that are just kind of flowing over. So the first step for this was to, while this was still attached to this plant, was to air layer, meaning I got these roots already established in this moss here before cutting it off. Then once I cut it off, this plant really started shooting out. And the next step here is going to be to take some pins and pin this into the dirt. And you may have seen projects like this before. Essentially, I'm going to swirl it around to create a little more fullness. And then once these are well rooted, these will come back in the pot too, and eventually this will be a much fuller pot. But for now, what I'd like to do is see if we can get these tiny little aerial roots here to establish down into the medium below. The tricky thing with this, I've seen this done before, where you want them to grow right into the dirt. And if you keep the dirt moist enough for these aerial roots to want to grow down into it, then the likelihood is that this plant is going to get a little bit overwatered and eventually may experience root rot. So I want to be really careful to avoid that. Root rot is something that's hard to come back from. So the idea here is I'm going to moisten some of this moss and get that underneath of this aerial root here, so that the top layer can be moist. That sphagnum moss will hold on to that moisture without the lower medium being so wet. So I'm going to take a pause here and get set up, and we'll get started. All right, so the first step is to get this moss like soggy wet. So it's a lot like a sponge. The way that it's kind of dry, it can be a bit hydrophobic until you really soak it, and then the idea is to squeeze it out a lot like a sponge until you've gotten most of the moisture out. So yes, the risk of root rot is a lot lower and mold in this situation, in my experience, than sticking a cutting directly in water. However, you definitely can get mold, so you don't want it to be too soggy. So you can see that's like totally wet. And the idea here is that I'm going to get a little bit of this sphagnum moss and get it underneath of each of these little aerial roots, and then I'm going to pin it in. So the pins that I'm working with are actually bobby pins. They sell pins that are made for this purpose. In my opinion, they don't work very well. And so I actually do a funny thing with bobby pins so that I can get them to stay put a little bit better. So by the time I'm done bending the pin inside out and backwards, it looks like that. There we go. And what I do is I take a good old bobby pin, like so, and some pliers, And I basically bend it inside out, backwards. And that gets it at a perfect angle. I basically over direct it. So at the bottom, it's kind of like a V of sorts. And then it really does the trick for holding that in there. So first step, get some moss. Give it a really good squeeze. You maybe can't see that. Give it a really good squeeze. So I realized that was maybe out of view before. So this is really wet. And I'm going to grab a little bit here and give it a good squeeze. Then I'm going to tuck it just under this little aerial root here, kind of around, surrounding it, so that there's going to be some moss inside of that pit. Get an up close view here in a minute. So here's the aerial root. It's underneath of the root and it's on top of it, so it's surrounding it. And then I gotta start paying my daughter to be my videographer for some of this stuff. Then I'm gonna pin around the root, right around where the aerial root is, and give a good push. Nuzzle some of that moss back in there. And then keep doing the same thing for each of these little aerial roots. Sometimes you can tell that it's like the little aerial root is really dried out. And sometimes it can be good to cut it if it looks like it's fried. So every time I see one of these, I'm going to bundle this up, wrap it around. And the idea here is it's going to root a lot faster than it would if I just pin these onto the top of soil, and it's so much less likely to rot. So we're going to untangle these a little bit, because essentially I'm going to have this one go underneath of these two. So you want to think about, kind of map it out. So you've got these two on top and that one underneath, and I'm just going to kind of bring that under this way. Snug that pin back into place and go from there. There's a really good likelihood that I will air layer, this section of vine, a lot like I have this one, to create some more cuttings. But for now, I'm just going to leave it attached. One thing that I've learned that's really helpful is plants, when you do just about anything to them, you repot them or you put them in a new room, you change their lighting situation, it gets a little bit shocked. And so you kind of want to take one step at a time with plants in order to give them time to acclimate. There's not really an aerial root on that one. See if we can get it to come out, but I'm going to be surprised if it does. So, let's see what I was saying there. I'm going to have to edit that part out. So one thing I don't want to do is like bend this stem too much. It's pretty sturdy. It's nice because as I'm wrapping it around, it's starting to get some tension on the side of the pod. So it's just kind of hanging out in that more rounded fashion. Just going along to each one. Need to bend another pin here. Oh, there's one. The cool thing about a project like this is, yes, I'm hoping for roots to grow down, but the other thing is that when you start to get roots on a node like this, there's a good chance that we'll actually get shoots too. What I'm hoping for first is roots, but there's a chance that new leaves will come out of the already established nodes when you create that kind of moisture. If you can see this one, let's see, I keep pulling that out. That's a really big, nice big aerial root right there. I have a feeling that that's going to be the first one to root down and anchor in. This is a great project for winter. You know, we don't see as much foliage growth in winter. The plant's in a more dormant state. And so what a better time to encourage it to root down than a time when it's not spending a ton of energy on foliage growth. So essentially, after I cut this one off, it has stimulated this new growth right here. And so I don't want to do too much with asking it to root until some of these little axillary buds that got stimulated push their leaves out. Because it's all energy. The plant is using energy to do each of these things. And so that's part of where getting some good fertilizer in the plant when you're doing a project like this is helpful. With this one, I'm using Super Thrive Foliage Pro. It's known as a hydroponic fertilizer, but it works great with plants that are in soil, or even better, I think, with this kind of sphagnum moss rooting. I don't think that pin is quite the shape that I want, so that one's not. I didn't quite get it bent right, and it's not behaving the way that I want to, which is why that part's important. So now it's crossing over, so that when I open it up and pin it onto this plant, by the time it gets down to the bottom, it pinches back in and it holds it in there a little more readily. One thing that you want to be careful for is kind of which way is this heavy part of the plant pulling. If it's pulling up, then it's likely going to pull your pins back out. You want to be a little bit careful with that. All right, so we got things tidied up here. I'm really pleased with how this turned out, both aesthetically. You can tell that the plant's looking a little more compact, and functionally, the pins are staying in really nicely. And from the view above, you can see this plant's kind of just more tucked together rather than three gangly vines coming out. So there's probably at least 8 to 10 points that are likely to root here, so that's great. I also wanted to give another view of this pin. I realized we didn't get a very good shot of that. So that's the shape of the pin, turned inside out and crossed over itself. That really helps to hold it into the dirt. So I want to talk a little bit more about maintenance. How do we maintain the right environment to continue to encourage root growth? And that's with moisture, but not too much. With a lot of air layering projects, I might use some kind of wrap or cover it, and that's not really ideal here. So the nice thing is pothos like to be misted, and I do mist this plant already every day. So when I go in and I give this a light mist here, I'm also going to come directly where I know that aerial root is and give a few sprays right in there. I'm doing that now just to get everything all happy for this plant. And I'll make sure those are all nice and moist and check on it daily for probably at least a week. I look at most of my plants daily, so for me that's totally doable. For some that might be kind of intensive, but it really is only about 7 to 10 days. You start seeing those roots, you give the plant a deep watering when it's ready, and then they are kind of become a part of the soil structure and can maintain more of a regular watering pattern. So then when it comes to this cutting that we got from this same plant, we're going to open this up a little bit and see how the roots look. It is interesting to keep these moist enough without being too moist. I really like the way that I wrapped this because it left a lot of air holes. And then when in the beginning of the video, you saw the Velcro, I really have that pressed tight where I know the roots are, so I can encourage the root to grow. And look at that. Let's see if we can get a really nice view on that happy little root there. So that is awesome news. I don't see any mold in here. If I did, I'd let it air out, maybe even replace the moss. This one's tough to see, but that's a happy little white root growing out there. There's also a brown root there. I'll probably cut that one, trim it back till I know that there is no rot. This root is not getting stimulated. The moss is moist, so maybe it's just a little bit of rot there. I'll look into that more. And hoping this one has activated because it was not doing so. You know, you want to be kind of gentle when you're opening these up. Every plant's a little different. Some have like web-like roots, and you wouldn't want to pull it open like this. You kind of have to trust the process a little bit more. This one is hugging into the moss below it. So, oh wow, that one went wild. That's the one I couldn't get to grow before. Look at that. Awesome. So this one's probably going to be ready to pot pretty soon. I like to stick with that kind of when it's growing secondary roots. I can tell you that it is because it's stuck on this piece of moss here. So that's growing to the side. But I'm going to give it a little more time. Whoop. And then this is fairly moist, but I'm going to give it another mist and wrap it back up. Before I do that, I'm going to take a little bit more of a look here. That one's rotten. Let's give it a little trim and then go from there. But this is great. So these guys are going to get cut out and put right back here in the middle where there's some space. And then this plant is just going to be ready to be happy and booming, especially come spring. It'll have all these healthy roots and be a much fuller, happier plant. Okay, so I have this beauty back in her spot, and I have decided that I think it would actually be helpful to wrap these roots up and do a little air layering so I can start establishing roots. I do know that I would like a few more propagations from this plant, and I'm going to give it some time, probably through spring, to just be growing roots this way before I give her a trim. And so I've got a little square of saran wrap, some moss, and some plant Velcro. And we are going to get this beauty wrapped up. So these are really well established aerial roots. I think that they will pop off quite nicely. The thing is that if they sit in the air for a long time, eventually they'll kind of get frizzled and they aren't as vital. And so I decided that now would be a good time to encourage some root growth here. So we essentially take the aerial root, put it right into the center of a big ball of moss. And then we get we got some extras there, we get our saran wrap. Wrap it around the bottom there. This one's interesting because I want to make sure, obviously, to miss the new foliage growth. So I'm being careful not to damage that. I'm going to wrap it diagonal in 2 directions, this way. Nice little tuck, kind of like swaddling a baby. And then I'm going to come around this way. Little air holes are totally okay. The more that you have, the quicker it'll dry out, but it is good to have a little bit of breathing room. And we'll see how much of a shot I can get here. I have not covered the leaf up, so the leaf is poking off the other side. And then I'm going to wrap this in a way that it'll snug that moss right around that root. And I will continue to do the same thing, probably just for 3 of these. This one here, and that one there. And now we'll move on to our next project. So next up, we're going to talk about one of my very favorite plants. This is the Scindapsus pictus. And I've got quite an odd, innovative situation going on here with this plant. The structure that it is attached to actually used to be a lamp, And eventually I'm going to build a big moss pole to support some big leaves and see if I can get this plant to size up. So you can see that it was producing leaves that are bigger than my hand. And then at some point it started shooting off. They're still healthy. I wouldn't call this a leggy branch, but it's not quite doing what I want it to do. So this project that I've got going on is with the intent just to air layer. I'm not going to keep it structurally on this pole. And so I'm just seeing if I can get each of these nodes to root so that I can trim this off down here at the mother plant and then encourage some of these roots to grow up onto that pole. So what we're going to do is check out these roots. They've been going for about 2 weeks now and see if we have much development, if it's time to chop and propagate or let it sit for a while longer. And then the next thing that we're going to think about is eventually I will want these roots to be ready to, these aerial roots to pop out and to be ready to grow into a pole. And I can start that process now so that when I'm ready, that I've got some long roots that will already attach into a pole. And then lastly, I've got this section that I did some plastic air layering on. I can already see we got some nice healthy roots there. And we're going to see if it's ready to cut. Okay, so let's start to open this up and see what kind of root growth that we've got going on. I really like these plastic back poles. They're helpful in keeping the moss moist while allowing them to root in. So I'm not seeing much growth there. We're just going to leave that part established. And then if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that that one's starting to sprout out. And this one's going to be hiding behind a little bit. You do want to be careful when you open these up. These have pretty sturdy roots, but we don't want to tear them out of the moss. I want to check and make sure it's not rotten. That one's just barely waking up. So when you start to see white is when you can tell that the aerial root has really decided to start booming. So this is going to need some more time. So these are happy. I'm not seeing any mold in the moss. They're great. I'm going to get it situated right back the way that I had it. And then we're going to take a look inside this one here. I have noticed that when I'm using the saran wrap that the roots are establishing quicker. So it does take work to keep that moss moist. And when you've got it covered, I'm seeing a little different results. Not a lot going on there either. Again, super healthy, but I'm not seeing anything very exciting. So we're just going to let this baby keep sprouting. All right, and then this one is looking a little more promising here. We'll unwrap that. It feels kind of crunchy and dry. Happy little roots. Yay. I'm not going to open it too much, but again, most of what we're assessing for is there any rot going on in there? And then we can see this tiny little baby happy root. This is lovely. So when we put this back together, it's a little bit dry. One thing that I like to do is spray the root directly. And then we've got some fresh moss here, just because I'm going to add to it. When it was wrapped, I could see that root growing out, so it's growing towards plastic, which is not helpful. Got a little bit of Foliage Pro fertilizer in here, and then I'm just going to make sure to really surround that root. Same thing over here with that little baby. I'm going to make sure it's really wrapped up and it has something to grow into. And then just give it a nice little tuck, like a burrito. And then I'll fasten that one together. So now we're going to put this baby back up on here. One thing that I did notice is that the happiest root, this baby here, the one that actually looked like it was sprouting, this one was really surrounded by moss, not only like pressed into the moss. So we're going to do that with each one here. And so see this little root? It's kind of meeting up right with the plastic. So one thing that I can do when I get this nice fresh bundle of moss is I'm kind of making a bridge over that so it's not bumping into plastic, it's running into moss. And then I'm going to surround that whole root so it'll stay a little bit more moist rather than just pinning it in on top like that. So then we press that pretty firmly there. And I get the sense that this time will be a little more successful. I didn't have it quite surrounded that way last time. This one that's happier was just meeting right up with the moss. So that's what we'll go for on the other notes. Just make a nice little bundle there. Get it good and snug. You always want the soft side of the Velcro towards the plant. The side's nice and fuzzy so it won't damage the plant. And we'll get that last one wrapped up in there too. And then here we have a Cebu blue pothos. You can see that the new leaves are kind of dainty. It does have some potential to get some pretty big leaves, and so I'd like to build this a nice tiny little moss pole. And I'm doing the same thing here. I'm trying to get these little aerial roots to establish so that when I build it a little pole and I put it upright like that, that it's already got roots that are ready to anchor into a pole. So you can really do this on quite a micro level. And when you train these babies to be on a moss pole early, then they establish really thick stalks and size up their leaves really quickly and have, it's cool because when you have your aerial roots that are getting a good amount of moisture and nutrients, you don't have to water your plant as much, and so you don't have as much risk of root rot. So let's see here. It's hard to tell, but that baby is actually growing, so it was just barely there before. And now we've got like a 1/2 centimeter of growth. Unfortunately, I let this moss totally dry out. So it kind of formed that little thin layer of dry tissue around it. And that's not ideal, but it's not a big problem. We're just gonna fix it back up here. I'm gonna get some fresh moss. It's nice when you start with fresh stuff that's been totally soaked and it's really evenly moist, versus like spraying it to get it moist, and so I usually like to do that if I can. So I'm going to make sure to really envelop that root. This is such a delicate plant, so it's not like something you want to really force. You have to be super gentle with it so we don't snap the end off. It's actually likely why it dried out so readily, because I really didn't want to yank on it and close it, but I'm just gonna take my time and make sure to get all the ends closed up this time so it really retains that moisture. Most of these plants that we try to keep in our house are tropical plants. They're used to 85% moisture most of the time, and that's why they have those little roots, because they will climb up a tree or a neighboring plant, and that plant has moisture. And so when they come out and they don't have anything to grow into, then they turn into dry little nubs. Lost potential, I tell you. So that one's happy. And the idea here is, again, we're going to start training those aerial roots before we get like a sturdy stalk so that it's really malleable and super willing to grow on a pole. Different from this beautiful silver sword philodendron that I got this one. It's barely bigger than when I got it, and so it's got these super sturdy stalks, and this plant was basically horizontal, so I really took my time encouraging it up, and that what you'll see from the side here as we start to unwrap this is that a lot of these stalks, there was no way I was going to be able to press them all the way up against the pole, so I essentially made this little bridge of moss And we're going to check it out and see what kind of roots we have going on. It's a little bit hard to tell, but this root right here is growing all the way down and anchoring into the pole right there. So that's super good news. So again, I'm basically making a bridge of moss, this big old chunk of moss between the plant and the pole. And we've got another super happy, successful root down here. Might try to like encourage it. Just go this way, baby. I'd rather it grow into the pole than grow into the ground below. But we don't have the utmost control here. And then again, I'm going to be pretty gentle here, but we just want to take a look and make sure. It's almost a little too moist. Do you see how dark this is? It's just a little bit too moist. So I'm going to hold off on watering. And before I wrap it up, I'm going to just let this all hang out, kind of a little bit more space, and let it air out so that we don't create a moldy situation here, because that can be detrimental. Just kind of scanning. I think I'm going to quit poking at this one because we have a good idea that it's happy and that its roots are growing. And again, just a little bit too wet. We're going to give it some time and some air and keep it happy. Just briefly, I've got the same thing going on with this Monstera. That one feels pretty dry. Open that one up. I will likely actually separate this into 3 different plants. It's young enough that I can probably do that without shocking it too bad. So this is like the first aerial roots that it even was thinking about growing. And when you catch it when it's that young, I don't even know what I got going on here. When you catch it when it's that young, it has great potential to train well onto a pole. I know what I got going on. Look at that. So it grew through this, and last time I see what I did was just went ahead and just wrapped around it one more time. So I'm not even going to open that inner layer. I might give it a little spray. No, actually it's good. I traded the moss out. That moss looked a little dark, and we just want to keep a really super healthy situation. I got it packed a little bit too tight. So this time I'm not going to like cram it on there. I'm just going to give it a loose little wrap. Probably get that tucked just a little bit better there. There we go. Perfect. So now it's got a little bit more air, but it's still doing its thing. So last couple things I want to share. Got this really cool propagation rack. I think you've seen them where these all hang on the wall. And I kept having water propagations just rot and die. It's so common. And I just wanted to bring light to the fact that you can totally put moss in here. I get the sense this one might be ready to plant, so we're going to check it out. But I just took a little band of cellophane and wrapped it around so that it keeps moist.
Okay.
All right, so that's the little Tradescantia. These ones root so easily. So I'm basically just having fun with this one. One thing I'm noticing is I have it packed a little tight. Maybe not enough air in there. This one is one of those that has like the delicate web of roots. And so I'm noticing, if you get up close there, we got tons of roots. So my plan here is just to take off these little bits. That one doesn't want to go. It's because it's got roots growing into it. So that's about all I'm going to do. And that's just a little plug that's going to go directly into soil. Okay, so this little beauty I do think is ready to plant. And one thing that can be helpful anytime you're transferring a propagation, whether it's in moss or in water, is to make sure that you're not going too big on the pot size. And, if it's swimming in the pot that you put it in, it's going to spend a ton of time on root development. The other thing is you'll notice I have the bottom covered so that it can just be swimming in soil at first. So I've got this nice aeroid mixture here. It's got some perlite and charcoal, some fine orchid bark and chunky orchid bark, and maybe only like 20% soil. Makes tons of room for the roots. and you just want it soggy wet at first with the propagation. So the benefit of using soil like this, when it's got all of that coarse material in it, is it can be soggy and still have plenty of space and air for the roots. And that sphagnum moss just goes right in there with it. The charcoal is really helpful to prevent mold. So I have maybe, in this little seedling mixture I made, I have probably 10% charcoal, which is more than I normally do. This helps the roots to kind of find its place in the soil and not be too compact. And then we pull it out and let it drain, and voila. So a couple things I wanted to mention about this transfer to clarify. What we want is for it to be super soggy, and the reason for that is that it's used to being in a basically 100% humidity environment. And if we give it this nice chunky soil, not only does that provide support, you can see it's giving like a nice sturdy base for the plant, but it allows you to have that moisture and drainage at the same time. And then the charcoal is helpful because if you want it that soggy, then it helps to absorb and redistribute that moisture more functionally. So what I love so much about using the sphagnum moss in these little tubes is I've essentially had a 0% rot rate with these, different than water. This is a precious little baby monstera cutting, and it's really important to me. I did not want to stick it in water and hope that it didn't rot, and I have not seen any rot with my sphagnum moss propagation, as long as I give them plenty of space and air. So next project here, the wonders of sphagnum moss. These are tiny little bare node propagations you've probably seen in my earlier videos. They started with these 1-inch sections of bare node vines, and these have been going since May. Some of them are dormant, and then they'll just kind of pop up. And I wanted to show a successful little repot here. So I just love the way that these, you know, they're just nice little brand new compact plants, different than when you take a cutting and it's already got some established leaves and it takes a while to kind of look structurally, aesthetically pleasing, whereas these little babies are just the cutest little starts I've ever seen. And another way that I use the sphagnum moss in these boxes is for cuttings for my terrarium plants. So these ones have been going in here for a really long time. It's got all of these happy, healthy roots. And you can actually see that the sphagnum moss is starting to regrow. So it seems like maybe I'm propagating sphagnum moss nowadays. What can I say? It's addictive. I've really enjoyed sharing all of these projects with you. There's a couple more kind of hiding in the background here. That's my Mican philodendron that I am training up the pole in the same way. Some cuttings of a purple heart that are super happily rooting in this container and ready to move today. But I think I'll wrap it up there, and I appreciate you guys joining me. Feel free to drop any comments that you have, any questions down below, and check out some of my other videos. I'll keep you posted with updates.